whenever I speak in Kentucky, I call it's a home game. My family, I was raised in Huntington, West Virginia. But genealogy, I'm from Greenup County, and then of course Montgomery County. You know, used to be Hood Station. There were all kind of hoods out there. So I am a collateral descendant of John Bell Hood. I descend from his grandfather Lucas. I'm not a direct descendant. Anyway, so like I said, it's a home game. Went to KMI. My son lives in Winchester. He does a lot of business in Lexington, so it's good to come up here. So this is also interesting. My publisher, Ted Savas, we finished the index on my book, and he said, I can't believe you can actually write a book where there's not the name Hood in the index, and there isn't. So, but a few years ago, at the beginning of the, this tearing down monuments and scrubbing names off of, buildings and landmarks and things, like I'm assuming everybody in this room, I got distressed by it. And of course it picked up steam. But I was thinking, you're tearing down the statues and you're, scrubbing the names. And I was wondering, the Civil War was 4 years long, and for most people who fought in it, it was actually less than 4, right? 3 years or 2 years or whatever. And I started wondering, what did these guys do after the war? A lot of people here in the service, and your entire life is normally, unless you're a retired career military, your life is not defined by your short service in the military. I sure hope, I heard a retired colonel here, I hope my career isn't defined by soaring rank of PFC in the Marine Corps, but no, I wonder, well, what did these guys do? And when I started my research, the entirety of my knowledge of former Confederates I knew that Stephen D. Lee was president of Mississippi State, and that's only because I was a member of the SCV. And I knew Robert E. Lee, right? Washington College, Washington and Lee. And I knew that Joe Wheeler was a general in the U.S. Army Volunteers during the Spanish-American War. I knew nothing else. So I started researching, and I get questions, pretty often. Where did you find this stuff? And it was from so many different sources that I've even kind of forgot. It was just kind of anywhere things would lead me. But I was discovering just some remarkable accomplishments that former Confederates achieved in national service, in professional societies. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write them down and maybe do a book if it ends up as as interesting as it started off. And I didn't have any criteria. This is another question I usually get at the end. I really didn't have any criteria. It was totally subjective on my part. And so I start, I'll come across somebody, I'll write it down. And then all of a sudden, it occurred to me pretty quick that I'm going to have to raise the bar, because your publisher usually limits you to roughly 100,000 words. So unless you want to get into multi-volume. So I kept raising the bar, and pretty soon I started feeling pretty guilty, because I was raising the bar up to where some Confederate veterans were not going to be included in my book, and that they accomplished a whole lot more in their life than I have in mine. Yet they don't qualify for my book. But you do have to limit it. And I ended up with around 850 names. And then I had to pare that down, and I ended up with somewhere around 200, 250 again, for subjective reasons. And in my book is, I don't even, you don't have time to give much when you've got 200 or 250. So a lot of those are consigned to an appendix, but I presented some profiles and some summaries of some of the ones that were pretty fascinating. And I organized it, and my presentation here is going to be organized. It's done in the same way that the book is organized. I didn't just want to do an alphabetical list. I didn't want a roster per se. So I broke it down into categories: public service, which is basically federal government-related appointments, United States government, and then education, because there were so many of these guys that founded universities and were presidents of universities. And then professional societies, engineers, attorneys, physicians, and U.S. military. I found a whole lot more than Joe Wheeler. And so I've got them categorized. And my presentation tonight is going to be, I'm going to go through some of the ones that I think are most interesting, and I think you all will find them most interesting and surprising. And I guess the whole theme is these guys, and that, by the way, military back then was all male. So, but these men were Americans. Then they followed the South, and then when the South lost the Civil War, most of them became patriotic Americans. And the last thing, before I get into the presentation itself, another thing that surprises me is you see a lot of the reunion pictures, and it seems like, generally speaking, the Union soldiers and the Confederate soldiers, when the war was over, it was over. And they had joint reunions, battle reunions, and things. And then, they seemed to get along. They tried to shoot, stab, and club each other to death. And when it was over, it seemed like they got along a whole lot better than the people who are mad about the statues today. It's 150 years ago. And, where is the reconciliation? Where is the forgiveness? Where do we move on? I mean, I see these people on TV. I mean, they're enraged. And I doubt if that happened too much. I'm sure there were some fists flew and whatnot among the veterans after the war. So anyway, it's reconciliation, forgiveness, and then getting together and build the country anew, the South anew. All right, he said forward and reverse here. Bear with me if I'm going the wrong direction. I am. There we go. This was very interesting, I thought. This statue is in Martha's Vineyard. And this is in Oak Bluffs. I don't know how many people are familiar with Martha's Vineyard, but Oak Bluffs is not where the Obamas and the Kennedys live. The people that work for the Obamas and Kennedys in Edgartown live in Oak Bluffs. But this is in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. And a Confederate veteran named William Strahan, he was a Virginia infantryman. After the war, he moved to, of all places, Martha's Vineyard. And he either bought the newspaper there or perhaps started the newspaper. By the way, I'm going to have a lot of details are in the book, but I am not Ed Bars, and I cannot remember every regiment and every company of every guy that ever fought in the war. But he either bought or opened a newspaper or started a newspaper. And it is no surprise, I'm sure, that there were not enough Confederate veterans for a UCV chapter, United Confederate Veterans chapter on Martha's Vineyard, but there was a GAR chapter. And Strahan, because he was a newspaperman, he covered events, and the GAR would have their annual commemorations and their events, and he covered them. And he got to know a lot of the Union veterans and became friends with them, and a lot of mutual respect. And he prospered in the newspaper business. And in the late 1800s, taking his own money, he purchased and erected this statue. And it's in honor of the Union soldiers of the American Civil War. In around 1902, 1903, the veterans were dying off, and Strahan was getting up in years. And the GAR chapter in the camp, or the GAR chapter on Martha's Vineyard, decided to honor Strahan. And they raised money, and this plaque that you see on the right is actually on the back of the statue. And I'm standing a little far away from it, but it says, "The chasm is closed. In memory of the restored Union, this tablet is dedicated by Union veterans of the Civil War and patriotic citizens of Martha's Vineyard in honor of the Confederate soldiers." So there is a statue was erected on Martha's Vineyard that a Confederate erected in honor of the Union soldiers, and then the Union soldiers reciprocated and added a plaque in honor of Confederate soldiers. Now, I haven't checked, but unsurprisingly, it became controversial here in the last few years. And I have not checked because I don't want to, because I'm afraid of what I will learn, but they were wanting to remove the plaque from the back of the statue, and I believe it was. Somebody, after one of my talks one time, somebody said, "You really don't want to check." So I believe it was moved off of the back. But that kind of reconciliation among the guys who were actually fighting each other, I mean, could you imagine something like this today? Unfortunately not. So here are, in education, now what I've done, there's just far too many individuals for me to cover. Kent said I have to keep this down to about 2 hours. Is that right? Anyway, but you'll see a lot of lists here, and I'm going to pause on this and I'll let you look at them. And if you happen to see your alma mater, or maybe one where you've sent a lot of checks for your children or whatever it is, and if you're curious, and by the way, I don't know of many people that write Civil War history books that do it for the money. You do it because you want to help and you want to share. If you see your alma mater up here, or you see anything, and you want to know details about it, you do not have to buy a book. Come up to me afterwards, or send me an email, and I'll send you anything I have on these people. But anyway, in education, college and university founders. Now these are in alphabetical order, and you can browse those. I found interestingly there were 4 colleges were founded by Confederate veterans for African Americans. Alabama State, Alcorn State, Prairie View A&M, and Arkansas Pine Bluff were founded for African Americans. Also a couple of women's colleges, because back in those days, colleges, women were not allowed in all colleges. By the way, my sons are in kind of a real estate development. They are restoring the Hagerman Women's College next to the Breckenridge House on 2nd Street. It was a women's college from 1900 to like 1930. But anyway, so these are the colleges, and then plus postgraduate schools, med schools, and law schools. And these were founded by Confederate veterans. Again, I've got the names and their, how they did it and what Confederate units they served in or commanded. And college and university presidents. Now, most of these are not surprising. It's not surprising that a former Confederate was the president of, say, University of Alabama. But there's some on there that are pretty interesting. And to me, the most interesting is Cal Berkeley. And I was telling Ted Savis, who lives in Sacramento, I said, "Ted, do we really want to put that in there?" I said, "Do you own anything in Berkeley? Just think of the dumpsters that are going to burn up and all that." But no, a president of Cal Berkeley, John LeConte, which I'll show him here in a second, was a former Confederate officer. And again, you'll see some interesting ones there. I wasn't looking for college professors, and by the way, to all you professors out there, I am using the term generically as a college teacher. So I know there are professors, assistant professors, and lecturers. I wasn't looking for them, but when I came across some interesting ones, I went ahead and jotted them down. Let me see, and I'll back up here. John LeConte he was president of Cal Berkeley 2 times, and he and his brother, Joseph LeConte, which I'll talk about here later in a few minutes, he and his brother were both chemists from South Carolina and brilliant. They were scientists. And their service, I'll tell this now instead of Joseph. Joseph LeConte actually wrote a memoir, which I was able to track down, and his brother Joseph. And Joseph says that he and his brother were commissioned as lieutenants, and they worked in the ordnance laboratories, the armaments and ordnance laboratories for the Confederates. He said the first time they got their first paycheck, it was at the rate of a major. And he said, my brother and I decided that we were not going to tell them that we were being paid at the major's rate. He said, so we really don't know whether we were majors or lieutenants because we never told them. So, but anyway, but he and his brother were lieutenants. These are your college professors. Now, again, some of them are not surprising. Auburn, Texas A&M, but there are some on there that I thought were surprising. Amherst, Confederate veteran. A Confederate veteran taught at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Like I said, Amherst, Johns Hopkins, University of the Pacific, San Francisco University. Back then, they didn't have any problem with the resume of the teachers as they probably would today. But again, you can browse those. Also, in the appendix of the book, I also have board of visitors, board of directors, board of governors, and there were several that served at West Point and Annapolis, board of governors. There were a few Confederate veterans who I went to Marshall University, which is like a third-tier state school, and I was not a Rhodes Scholar, so maybe I'm a little more impressed by people with accomplishments like, for instance, John Mallet. John Mallet was actually born in Ireland and went to university in Ireland and then also to Heidelberg University in Germany, and then came over to the United States before the Civil War to study, and he never went back to Ireland. And you can read here some of the things he did. He taught at Amherst, University of Alabama, Johns Hopkins, UVA, Jefferson Medical College, faculty chairman at University of Texas, and then the professional societies he was a member of, American Chemical Society, United States Assay Commission, and a fellow, Royal Society of UK, College of Physicians, Philadelphia, Medical Society of Virginia, Arts and Sciences, all of it, international, the German Chemical Society, French Chemical Society, and there's several of these guys. One of them that has an incredible resume, has a name that matches. This guy's name is Basil Gildersleeve. I mean, you got to be smart to have a name like that. He's in the book. Presidents of national professional societies, and you see him up here. I normally make jokes about the ABA and lawyers and the Bar Association because my son is a lawyer, so that allows me to do it, but I am not going to do it with Kent here tonight. Our lawyer, my wife and I, he's the black sheep of the family. We don't know what happened. No, he's a good kid. But anyway, there were 4 former Confederates that were members of president of the AMA and all of these other societies, the ABA, and then surprisingly, a co-founder of the Sierra Club, along with John Muir, the iconic preservationist and naturalist, was John LeCompte's brother, Joseph LeCompte. And I tell everybody, that's the way I want to look when I grow up. I want to look like that guy. And so maybe I will in a few years. But Joseph LeCompte and his brother, they were fascinating guys. There are several things named after him, though some of the things have been renamed, and probably at some point they're all going to be erased. But there's a Mount LeCompte in the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm not sure, is it North Carolina or Tennessee, or maybe both states. There's also Mount LeCompte in Yosemite National Park. LeCompte was, you don't want to call him the father of Yosemite, but he was involved in getting it preserved before it became Yosemite. There's a LeCompte Glacier, a LeCompte Valley, Mount LeCompte. The Sierra Club in the 1930s built a lodge in Yosemite, and it was the LeCompte Lodge until 2 years ago. And it is now the Sierra Lodge because they got a hold of his memoirs. And, he said some things the wrong way. And there was a LeCompte Middle School in San Francisco, LeCompte, there's various things, and they're starting to come down. So hopefully they won't all go away. Joseph LeCompte, post-war chemist, geologist, educator, chairman of the Department of Chemical Pharmacology, Mineralogy and Geology at the University of South Carolina, chairman of the Department of Geology at the University of Cal Berkeley, where his brother was president, professor of physiology, co-founder Sierra Club, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, member of the American Philosophical Society, National Academy of Sciences, namesake, as I said, of Mount LeCompte, Great Smoky Mountains, Mount LeCompte in the Sierra Nevada Mountains, and the lodges and things. So the Confederate lieutenant, or perhaps a major. Simon Baruch, a famous Jewish Confederate physician from Charleston. His son was Bernard Baruch. If we have any people that are involved in finance, Bernard Baruch is one of the early titans, if you will, of Wall Street. Was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson for the war effort in World War I. But Baruch was the surgeon in the 13th Mississippi. He was captured at Gettysburg. Well, he wasn't captured. He stayed to care for the wounded, and voluntarily, if you will, was captured. And then he was exchanged and released and rejoined the 13th Mississippi and was there for the duration of the war. He was a physician in Columbia, South Carolina, or Charleston, excuse me. He went to New York and volunteered for a year to work in the slums of New York, and came back to Charleston, but then ended up moving to New York and spent the rest of his life there. He was one of the early proponents of public hygiene and in the slums of New York, and with the sewers and clean water and bathhouses, because a lot of the slum tenements didn't have those. But things that are named in Simon Baruch's honor, though most of these were done by his son. But there's the Simon Baruch, there's the academic chairs at Columbia University, Clemson, New York University College of Medicine, New York City Department of Education's Middle School 104 is named the Simon Baruch Middle School. There's a Baruch Park in New York City. If they start renaming these things, it's going to cost them a bunch just to do the name change. This was another interesting one. Hampton Coit Dubose. He was a Citadel cadet, which became the the South Carolina Battalion of Cadets. And VMI cadets fought at Newmarket, and then some support at Petersburg and Richmond. But the Citadel cadets actually fought in some battles during Sherman's operations in North Carolina and South Carolina. But after the war, Dubose became a Presbyterian missionary and went to China with his wife. He ended up living his entire life there, died there, and is buried there. But you can read how active he was in fighting the opium trade and was involved in with the Chinese emperor and getting them to control the trade. And I wasn't aware. I thought back in those days they actually manufactured the opium or made the opium in China, but as it turns out, most of it was in Afghanistan, but it was shipped through China and distributed throughout the world back in the 19th century from China. So they got the he was heavily involved in that. He was, again, a former Confederate. South Carolina Hall of Fame, which is like 2 miles from my house, coincidentally, but Colonel Ambrosio Gonzalez, he was a Cuban Confederate American, I guess. Can you use 2 hyphens? Anyway, he was an engineer, spent the war mainly on the coastal fortifications of Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina. And anyway, he, after the war, he and his sons founded the State newspaper. The State is the name of the newspaper in Columbia, and it's the big newspaper in South Carolina. But he was inducted into the South Carolina Hall of Fame for his work after the war. He was the first scholar, if you will, who chronicled the Gullah African dialect that was spoken and is still spoken in some of the barrier islands in the Low Country, South Carolina. But he chronicled it and studied it. And then Major James Coker founded Coker College. It might be Coker University now. But he also, there's a company in South Carolina, it's called Sonoco, or it's like Sunoco, except it's S-O-N. And it's a huge company. It has 22,000 employees and operates all over the world. And it was founded by Major James Lyde Coker. Great Floridians, it's kind of like I was going to say, it's not, probably a little more than a Kentucky Colonel, but it's the Department of State of Florida. It's like a Florida Hall of Fame, if you will. And in the year 2000, Senator David Yulee, he was another Jewish Confederate. I thought that he was a Jewish Confederate senator from Florida. He was not. He was a Jewish senator from Florida before the Civil War. And then after Florida seceded, he was not actually an elected politician, but he was such a confidant and an advisor to Jefferson Davis that he was actually arrested and imprisoned for several months after the war before he was pardoned. But that's David Yulee. And then Colonel Francis Dancy, and I haven't been able to find a photo of him that I am confident enough is him, but he was involved in the establishment of the Florida citrus industry, which we might take for granted, but if we were in Florida, we probably wouldn't. And he's in the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame and some other things. Sergeant Major Amory Coffin was an engineer, and after the war, he went to work for one of the big construction companies around Pittsburgh. And, we're back at the turn of the century. There were some huge construction companies out of Pittsburgh because that's where all the steel, American Bridge. And as the country was being built and industrialized, you go where the steel mills and the steel processing firms are. But anyway, Major Amory Coffin was in a high supervisory role for the construction of, and these were some of the buildings. That's the Wisconsin State Capitol. In the middle there on the bottom, believe it or not, that is one of the early incarnations of Madison Square Garden. Of course, it's been torn down and rebuilt several times, but one of the projects that he supervised is still there. That's the New York Stock Exchange. Colonel Samuel Lockett, also an engineer. He went to work, He was heavily involved in the supervision of the design and construction of the base of the Statue of Liberty. And he went to work for what was, today it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not sure what it was called at the time, but worked for the U.S. Army all over the world. Went to Egypt and then in South America. Actually, he died in Bolivia while working for the U.S. Army Engineers, and he's buried there. Somebody mentioned interviewing Douglas MacArthur. This was just kind of a interesting little trivia sort of a thing. But Augustus Braysaucher, and I'm guessing at the pronunciation of his name, he was the medical director for Frank Cheatham's Corps. It's, in other words, the highest ranking surgeon in Frank Cheatham's Corps. For those of you that are interested in the Battle of Franklin, November 30th, 1864, the epicenter of the Battle of Franklin was the Carter House and the Carter Cotton Gin. And it was Frank Cheatham's Corps clashing with the Union line. And in the epicenter of the Union line was Major Arthur MacArthur of the 24th Wisconsin Infantry. And Arthur MacArthur was seriously wounded at the Battle of Franklin by Frank Cheatham's Corps, of which Braysaucher was the head surgeon. Well, after the war, Arthur MacArthur stayed in the regular U.S. Army, and in 1888, he was stationed at Little Rock Barracks in Arkansas, and his wife was pregnant, went into labor a couple of weeks early, and their obstetrician wasn't there. So their baby was delivered by Dr. Augustus Braysaucher, whose comrades had almost killed Major Arthur MacArthur, and the baby that he delivered was Douglas MacArthur. So, if you all know Tom Cartwright from down at Franklin, he is a very charismatic tour guide and historian down there. I told him about this one. He said, "I'm going to tell that one to every group I take." So he's a very folksy guy, very knowledgeable. This one I found very interesting. Albert Freeman Africanus King. You got to be smart if you got 4 names. And Albert King, and I did not know this till I started my research. I thought that surgeons or assistant surgeons, I thought Civil War surgeons, Union and Confederate, I thought they were in the Army. But I found out they were not all in the Army. Some actually enlisted, but others were just hired as contract surgeons, if you will. And that was the case with Dr. Albert King. He was surgeon of the 15th Alabama. And when his contract expired in, I think, in late 1864, he did not renew. And he moved to Washington, D.C., and went to work in one of the several Union hospitals, the Army hospitals in D.C. And he just happened to be at Ford's Theater on the night that Lincoln was shot. And he was one of the first 3 physicians that attended to Abraham Lincoln, and he carried him across the street, to the hotel where he died. But they didn't have any problem with the fact that 5 months earlier he was serving in the Confederate Army. They entrusted Lincoln's life to him. Public service. The ones that I put in the book that were really the more interesting ones are, again, it isn't necessarily surprising that a former Confederate is elected to office or appointed to public office in any of the 11 seceded states, or even in Kentucky, Missouri, or Maryland. But some of them that I found were interesting was the Adjutant General of the state of Montana after the war was Charles Turner, who was a Battle of Newmarket veteran. Lieutenant Samuel Shannon was on the staff of Robert Anderson, and he was Secretary of State of Wyoming after the war. Interesting little side note, as I was reading up on him, he was single and he was a dapper Dan, and he was quite the ladies' man, supposedly. And he looked like he took a while to get ready for his photo. The next guy is a Kentuckian, John Stuart Williams. I did not find where he had a reputation as a ladies' man. I didn't find any of that. Might have been. But John Stuart Williams, Kentucky cavalry commander, he and the owner or perhaps the founder of the Louisville Courier-Journal, Heilemann. He and Heilemann founded the city of Naples, Florida. John Williams did. Also, Fort Myers, Florida, speaking of that part of Florida, is named after Abraham Myers, who was a Confederate quartermaster general. He didn't found it, but whoever it was that founded Fort Myers, Florida, named it after Colonel Myers. And then mayors. Again, a Confederate veteran being the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama is of no surprise, but a mayor of Ogden, Utah, after the war, I thought was interesting. This one, I was also afraid it was going to cause trouble. A mayor of Minneapolis was Lieutenant Philip Winston on the staff of General Thomas Rosser. And this one I thought was extremely interesting. Mayor of Los Angeles from 1900 to 1902 was Captain Cameron Tom. He also founded the city of Glendale, which at the time was a city and now it's just a part of LA. But he was a founder of Glendale, California. State and territory governors, again, the 11 seceded states, or even, Kentucky is not necessarily surprising, but I'm from West Virginia. We seceded from Virginia, yet we elected 2 Confederate veterans as governors of West Virginia. And in New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Alaska, of course it was actually before it was a territory, it was just a possession of the U.S. government, and they would send representatives out there to administer the region before it became a territory. And one of those was a Confederate veteran. Also the Panama Canal Zone, which until I started studying up on this, I thought, the Panama, I've flown over it a couple of times, and it looks like a river, it's no big deal. But if you read about the history of the Panama Canal, it's, one of the marvels of engineering. And it was a compendium or a consortium of 5 different countries, and whoever it was that was chairman of the commission, the Panama Canal Commission, was the de facto governor of Panama, and it was a Confederate veteran. All right, and then we were talking about Army, and I told you Joe Wheeler. I knew of Joe Wheeler. Fitzhugh Lee also. I felt kind of dumb when that hadn't occurred to me. But anyway, Fitzhugh Lee, Thomas Rosser, and Matthew Butler all became U.S. Army generals during the Spanish-American War. All of these were cavalry commanders. But as I did more research, I found out there weren't 4 Confederate veterans that commanded U.S. troops in the Spanish-American War. There were 8. And there's John Castleman, Louisville, Henry T. Douglas, William Gordon, and William C. Oates of Little Round Top fame. Generals in the Spanish-American War was so short, and I forget who it was, some politician or somebody, they called it a splendid little war because it was so short and so few casualties. Some of these commanders actually commanded troops in combat. Others were there but weren't engaged. Others were en route, and some of them were still training in Florida and Texas. But the United States government had the confidence and the trust in these former Confederates to place them in command of U.S. Army troops. This is a picture of Joe Wheeler. This is after the Battle of San Juan Hill, and those are his subordinate commanders. And if the one on the right looks familiar, it's Teddy Roosevelt. Lieutenant Colonel Teddy Roosevelt of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, and his commander in the Battle of San Juan Hill was Joe Wheeler. Joe Wheeler remained in the U.S. Army after the volunteers were mustered out. He remained in the U.S. Army as, I believe, a major general. Ambassadors, ministers, and consuls, these were appointed by the U.S. government to represent the United States on the other side of the world before telephone, telegraph, or anything else. If you appointed somebody to represent the United States, 10,000 miles away, you had to trust them and you had to have confidence in them, and you certainly would not question their patriotism. But these are the countries, and this one really surprised me. 2 secretaries of the United States Navy were former Confederates. These guys were sort of in charge of the very ships they were trying to sink earlier. But Hillary Herbert, or Hebert, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. If you're from North Alabama, it's Herbert, and if you're from South Alabama, it might be Hebert, and Colonel William Hunt of Louisiana, Secretary of the U.S. Navy. It's Panama Canal Commission I just mentioned. Benjamin Harrod, he was from Louisiana, Confederate. David Key was Postmaster General. We might take the post office for granted nowadays, but back in the 19th century, it was a pretty big deal. This is the greatest name ever, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar. And he's from Mississippi. He actually raised the 19th Mississippi Infantry. Was lieutenant colonel, but only for a short while. He had health problems, and so he resigned. But he was Secretary of the Interior. Solicitor General, Private John Good, 2nd Virginia Cavalry. And again, I was not sure. When I think solicitor, I think of somebody trying to sell me something. But I find out that the Solicitor General, that is kind of an obscure position to people who are not in the legal profession. But for those of you that don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kent, but the Solicitor General represents the United States government in cases before the United States Supreme Court. So, and actually, I haven't upgraded my PowerPoint, but there are actually 2 former Confederates that were appointed Solicitor General of the United States. Attorney General, 2 Attorneys General. Amos Ackerman, he was on the staff of Robert Toombs. He was from Georgia. Augustus Garland was not in the military, but he was a congressman or a senator from Arkansas, appointed Attorney General. By the way, there were 10 U.S. presidents, starting with Grant and ending with Woodrow Wilson. 10 consecutive U.S. presidents appointed former Confederates to federal government positions. Calvin Coolidge actually retained one, but he didn't appoint one. So there were 11 former Confederates, 11 post-war presidents had former Confederates or Confederate veterans serving in the U.S. government. Ackerman only served for 15 months, 14 or 15 months, under Ulysses Grant. He ended up being asked to resign and did so. He was controversial because he was being too tough on the Ku Klux Klan. Georgian. But he served for 14 months under Ulysses Grant. 3 associate justices of the U.S. Supreme Court were Confederate veterans. Horace Lurton from Tennessee and Kentucky Cavalry. Hal Jackson, he was not military, he was Confederate government representative. And then there's Lucius Q.C. Lamar. He had been Interior Secretary and he was appointed justice. And then a Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was Lieutenant Douglas White of the 9th Louisiana Cavalry. They could have typecast this guy, couldn't they? You know, for the scene in the movie where the guy with the New York license plate gets pulled over in Mississippi for having a headlight out and ends up having to go before the judge, and he looks at that guy. Anyway, again, you know, I hear, you know, Confederates were traitors and, you know, they were guilty of treason. And if you go on some of the discussion boards, there's all these arguments of, you know, were they technically guilty of treason? Well, they didn't try them because they did, blah, 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 blah. And my whole point is, look, all I know is that the United States government after the war did not consider them traitors, because you wouldn't appoint a traitor who got off on a technicality to be your Attorney General or on your Supreme Court or Secretary of the Navy or to represent the United States in Hong Kong. which was John Singleton Mosby, excuse me. So, and then at the end, I found tons of patents just for fun. I put a couple of them in. Eli Hamilton Janney, he invented the knuckle coupler for rail cars, which is used all over the world today. Used to be they had the pin, and it was like the most dangerous job in the world was working on the railroad. I think by now most people have heard that the guy who invented, or if you will, Coca-Cola, Lieutenant John Stiff Pemberton, is a Georgian. He suffered a saber wound in combat, and he was discharged. And he went to he was a pharmacist. He mixed up a concoction to fight the pain. That is it's not the concoction we drink now, but he invented Coca-Cola, if you will. And then also we're coming on the season where some of you all might be singing along Jingle Bells. Well, if you do, that was written and copyrighted by Captain James Pierpont of the 5th Georgia Cavalry. He was from Connecticut, moved south before the Civil War and joined up, and is the writer of Jingle Bells. You know, I might have just ruined that song for you. I might be singing it and you're thinking, but anyway, so these were just some of the couple of hundred former Confederates, and I've said what I hope that I accomplish with this book is I think most of the statues that are coming down or being destroyed or names that are being erased, I think it's so emotional on the part of the people that are doing it that you know, reasoning with them or facts sometimes don't have a whole lot of impact you know, when you're emotional about anything. But I tell people, and I've shared a lot of my information, you know, people email me and all that, and you know, if somebody can go into maybe one board of directors meeting or one county commission meeting or one city council meeting and say, hey, you know, after the war, 11 U.S. presidents, Supreme Court, and this and that and the other, if it saves one statue, if it saves one little bit of our history, it will have been worthwhile to me chronicling all this, digging it up and chronicling it.